Osiyo, that's the Cherokee word for hello. The Cherokee were a very large and powerful tribe who moved to the southern Appalachian Mountains from the northeast and the Great Lakes region in the U.S. Thousands of years ago. And they lived in a massive area which included parts of North and South Carolina, northern Georgia, southwest Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, northern Alabama, Mississippi, and even over into western Florida. The Cherokee could be fierce and warlike, particularly our people's Wolf Clan. The Wolf Clan was the largest producer of war chiefs and warriors and were the protector of the entire tribe. But the Cherokee were primarily hunters and farmers and lived in a matriarchal society. Following the Revolutionary War, George Washington began a civilizing program which led to the Cherokee being the largest of what are called the five civilized tribes. Now these were nations of Native American Indians who had adopted cultural lifestyles and the customs of white colonists and settlers. Generally they lived in cabins, not in wattle and daub huts or teepees. They wore European-style dress, not breechcloths and feathered headdresses. They adopted European farming techniques and tools, and they produced corn and cotton and owned very large plantations. They owned black slaves and actually went to Christian churches. Now the five civilized tribes included the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole Indians.
Okay, here's some information that might be interesting leading up to the Trail of Tears. During the 1790s, there was a Cherokee named James Van. Now, Van's mother was a full-blood Cherokee and his father was a Scottish trader. That happened quite often during that time. He became a very wealthy businessman and a tribal leader. And he owned the largest and most prosperous plantation in the Cherokee Nation. It covered over 1,000 acres and was worked by over 100 African slaves, which James owned. Now, one of his problems was that Van was a drunk. Well, that may be a little harsh. Let me say, like people in his time did, his character was weakened by alcohol. And when he became drunk, he also became abusive. He killed 3 of his African slaves while he was drunk. He killed his brother-in-law, and he killed a random soldier whom he met up with and had a disagreement with. But it finally caught up to him. He was murdered at his front door by an unknown hand, probably someone he had problems with in the past, and his son Joseph inherited his land and business. Now Joseph was called Fat Joe because he was rather a heavy, stout fella. But anyway, the Van plantation was confiscated by the state and listed in the Georgia Land Lottery around 1830. And Joseph Van, Fat Joe, was forced to move his family to Oklahoma Indian Territory even prior to the forced removal on the Trail of Tears. And the Van plantation is located in Chatsworth, Georgia, and it's open to the public. Located near the plantation was another business that Van started, the Van Tavern, very profitable. Kind of a chicken and egg thing, I think. Did Van stay drunk because he had the tavern, or did he establish the tavern because he wanted to drink all the time? We don't know, but we do know that that original building was disassembled in 1955, and it was moved to New Echota. Now, New Echota, located near Calhoun, Georgia, was one of the most significant of Cherokee Indian sites. Why? New Echota was the capital of the entire Cherokee Nation, and it is located near Calhoun, Georgia, just an easy ride up I-75 toward Chattanooga. Like I say, it's open to the public, and it's quite something to see. It shows you very well how sophisticated and assimilated into the white culture the Cherokee people at that time were becoming. The nation, by the time New Echota was established, had created their own electoral districts. They had founded a Supreme Court. They adopted a written constitution that created a government with three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. A principal chief was elected by the National Council, which was their legislature. And New Echota was also the site of the first Indian language newspaper office in the entire country, the Cherokee Phoenix. It was also the site of a court case which carried to the U.S. Supreme Court concerning Cherokee lands and the ownership of them, and the site of a treaty signing which relinquished Cherokee claims to all lands east of the Mississippi. Perhaps most importantly to us, though, New Echota was an assembly point of Indians for removal west and is considered to be where the tragic Trail of Tears officially began. The Treaty of New Echota, relinquishing Cherokee land east of the Mississippi, was signed by U.S. government officials and a number of Cherokee who claimed to represent their 17,000-member tribe. In fact, there were about 500 who grouped together and claimed to represent the tribe. The treaty gave the Cherokee Nation $5 million and land in Oklahoma in exchange for their 7 million acres of ancestral land in the east. The majority of Cherokee opposed the treaty, but a wealthy planter, slave owner, and ferryman named Major Ridge. The Ridge comes from his Cherokee name, which means he who walks on the ridge. And in the War of 1812, he gained the rank of major, and thus his name, Major Ridge. He organized a group who believed that relocation was inevitable. He gathered leaders of this faction and federal Indian agents at his home in Rome, Georgia, which again is open to the public and still there, to negotiate a treaty based on the government's $5 million offer. The treaty was signed then at the Cherokee capital at New Echota on December the 29th, 1835, becoming known as the New Echota Treaty. Major Ridge realized that his death was probably imminent for selling tribal lands, and as he signed the treaty, he commented, "I've just signed my death warrant." Well, that was a real premonition, because Ridge, along with his son John and his nephew Elias Boudinot, who also signed the New Echota Treaty, were all assassinated on the same day, June 22, 1839, at the hand of their fellow Cherokees. They had already moved to Oklahoma that time, and Major Ridge is buried along with John in the Polson Cemetery in Delaware County, Oklahoma. Boudinot is buried in the Wooster Cemetery in Park Hill, Oklahoma, and you can see their graves very easily. Now, not only the majority of Cherokee opposed the treaty, but many prominent whites also supported the Cherokees' fight to keep their lands. Among them were some names you'll recognize, probably Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, Sam Houston, who was actually an adopted Cherokee, and Tennessee frontiersman Davy Crockett. Crockett believed that the treatment of the Cherokee had been, and I'll quote him, unjust, dishonest, cruel, and short-sighted in the extreme. In fact, he said, "I've been threatened that if I do not support the policy of removal, my career will be summarily cut off. But while I'm perhaps as desirous of pleasing my constituents and of coinciding with my colleagues as any man in Congress is, I cannot permit myself to do so at the expense of my honor and my conscience in the support of such a measure. Indeed, President Andrew Jackson's influence soon ended Crockett's career, and he left for Texas and the Alamo. And at that time, President Andrew Jackson doubled down on his efforts to remove the Cherokee and relocate them to Oklahoma. But by early 1838, only about 2,000 Cherokee had moved west voluntarily. So that spring, the federal government sent 7,000 soldiers under General Winfield Scott to evict the remaining Cherokee. Scott ordered that 23, quote, collection posts, he called them. They were actually illegal stockades, but illegal because they were built on Cherokee territory. But he ordered that 23 of these be established across the southeast, and that they should have shade, water, security, and so forth. The Indians would then be collected at these posts and transferred in large groups to embarkation points along the Tennessee River. These posts actually turned out to be more like concentration camps with 16-foot high walls and sharpened pickets made of split logs that were set into the ground, with little shade and absolutely no shelter from the elements. Local state militia, aided by Scott's soldiers, were charged with the actual rounding up of the Indians. And guess what? Georgians were the very first to begin their collection of Cherokees on May the 26th, 1838. That date had been kept secret so that the Cherokees would not flee and hide in the mountains. Families at dinner were startled by Georgia militiamen at their doorway and driven out of their homes to the stockade. Men were seized in the fields. Women were taken from their spinning wheels in the home, and children from their play. In many cases, when they turned around for one last look at their homes, they saw their homes in flames because there was a lawless group of rabble, if you will, that followed on the heels of the soldiers to loot and pillage and take all of the Cherokees' belongings that they wanted. In most instances, the whites were even driving off their cattle and other stock before the soldiers started pushing the Indians toward the stockade. The militia drove the Indians like cattle through rivers and overland toward the concentration forts, and most had been seized without even permitting them to gather up any clothes, blankets, belongings, or anything else. And in many cases, families were separated from their children, and sick and elderly were left behind or lost. Now, there's a missionary named Reverend Daniel Buttrick. He was a missionary to the Cherokee, and in fact was a part of one of the detachments relocating the Cherokee from the east to the new territory in Oklahoma, and you'll hear more about him later. But he wrote a diary, and in his diary he wrote, and I'll quote him a little bit, "From their first arrest, they were obliged to live very much like animals, and during their travels they were obliged at night to lie down on the naked ground in the open air, exposed to wind and rain, and herd together, men, women, children, like droves of dogs, and in this way many were hastening to a premature grave." So that's a little bit of what the Cherokee and our Cherokee family were experiencing during that time. Some of the captives were even started on their way west right away, particularly those that were being sent along a water route, and we'll explain the routes of the Trail of Tears more in our next session. but most were destined to spend several months in the camps with only what they had on their backs, suffering from exposure, disease, and the deaths of family and friends, even before they began their journey to Oklahoma.
Next up, we'll invite you to go along with us as we follow the original route of the Trail of Tears from Georgia to the present capital of the Cherokee Nation in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Lately I've been asked, why did you feel compelled to follow the Trail of Tears all the way to Oklahoma? Well, I thought about that, and I think that two young Cherokee girls who rode their bikes in the annual Remember the Removal ride from Cherokee, North Carolina to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, probably said it the best. So I'll just echo what Melanie Gang and Whitney Roach said to us. To us, it's not just a chance to learn about our ancestors, but that we also get a chance to retrace the trail and reflect on the hardships that our relatives endured. Our ancestors are why we're here, and it's totally important for us to remember them and to retrace their steps in remembrance of their strength and resilience. Now, you know there's no word for goodbye in the Cherokee language. They just say, let us meet again. So like the Cherokee, I'll just say, Donadago Wai Wado.